Welcome back to the deep dive. You've definitely heard the promise, right? AI is going to fundamentally change how your business operates, bring this massive productivity revolution. But if you're maybe sitting there wondering, okay, where is it? Well, you are definitely not alone. Today, we are digging into maybe the biggest paradox in business right now, this huge investment in AI versus almost zero return for nearly everyone. Our sources really center on this honestly astonishing statistic from a recent MIT study. It's sobering. Despite companies globally pouring, what is it, somewhere between 30 and $40 billion into generative AI, that study found a staggering 95%, 95, of organizations they looked at are getting exactly zero measurable return on that massive investment.
Yeah, that finding, that 95% failure rate for ROI, that's what we're calling the Gen AI divide adoption. It's incredibly high. I mean, almost every company is trying something, piloting some tool. But the actual deep structural transformation, the kind you need to really deliver value, that's incredibly rare. So our mission today is really to crack open this divide, figure out why companies are exploring the simpler generic tools pretty successfully, but then failing, often completely, to get those big enterprise-grade solutions into production. And crucially, we want to shed light on what that successful 5% are actually doing differently to get millions in real repeatable business value.
Okay, let's unpack this because that 95% number, it's seismic. We know from our sources it rattled tech investors, as one put it. Makes sense. But hang on, if we're still in the really early sort of experimental stages of a new tech, shouldn't we expect a pretty high failure rate anyway? I mean, some industry leaders are pushing back, right? Saying this is just the Wild West. Why is 95% failure something more than just normal growing pains?
That's a really important question. And yeah, it's true. You absolutely expect a lot of pilots to fail early on. It is a bit of a Wild West. But the studies suggest the problem isn't just that AI tech is, inherently flaky right now. The failure rate seems driven much more by how companies are trying to implement it, not just whether an individual pilot works or fails. I think the study's most powerful data point wasn't just the high pilot failure number itself, but the architectural difference between the successes and the failures. Companies that tried to basically DIY it, build their own AI stack, manage the underlying data systems, the vector databases, handle security, workflows themselves, they failed at double the rate, twice as often as companies that used applied, often external solutions. So that suggests the real issue isn't necessarily the core AI model itself. It's the sheer complexity of trying to integrate this constantly learning dynamic system into what are often brittle, static, old legacy workflows.
Okay. So it's less about is AI ready and more about are we ready to integrate it properly? The problem isn't a lack of trying, maybe, but a failure in the fundamental approach. So the divide isn't really AI users versus non-users. It's between those who can figure out the integration and those who just get bogged down in the infrastructure weeds.
Precisely. And you see this chasm really clearly when you compare those simple generic tools versus the big mission-critical systems. So look at things like ChatGPT, Copilot, generic productivity boosters. Adoption figures, they look great. Over 80% of organizations explored them. Nearly 40% actually report deploying them somewhere. And these are, quick wins. Better emails, faster research summaries, individual productivity stuff. But then you look at the vendor-sold, custom enterprise-grade systems, the ones meant to automate a whole business unit or process. Suddenly, the success numbers just collapse. 60% looked at them, evaluated them. Okay. But only 20% even got to the pilot stage. And here's the kicker. A tiny 5% successfully got them into actual production. That 95% failure rate we started with is really defined by this inability to scale those big enterprise efforts beyond just a trial run.
Wow. That's a huge gap. 4 out of 10 companies can roll out Copilot, fine, but 19 out of 20 fail to get a serious enterprise AI system running live. That says a lot about how hard it is to go from simple individual boosts to actual structural change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that lack of structural change, you can see it across whole industries. The analysis showed only 2 sectors, tech and media and telecom, maybe unsurprisingly show clear, widespread signs of structural disruption from AI so far. 7 out of the 9 major sectors studied, lots of pilot activity, sure, but very little fundamental shift in how they actually operate day to day.
Yeah, and you hear that frustration on the ground. We found this really powerful quote from a COO at a mid-market manufacturing company. He said something like, "The hype on LinkedIn says everything has changed, but in our operations, nothing fundamental has shifted. We're processing some contracts faster, maybe, but that's about it." It just perfectly captures that tension, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Between the huge excitement and the much more grounded reality for most businesses.
And that reality, it's rooted in what seems to be the core barrier for enterprise adoption, what the sources call the learning gap. The main reason these big enterprise pilots stall out, the tools often have brittle workflows. They lack contextual learning. And crucially, they just don't retain feedback or adapt over time. The system you painstakingly train on Monday, it's the exact same dumb system you use on Friday. So the user has to constantly reprompt, constantly feed it context it should already know. It's exhausting, which creates this really weird user paradox. You have employees reporting high concerns about model quality when they use the official company-provided enterprise tools. Yet those same professionals are often enthusiastically using consumer LLMs like ChatGPT in their daily work. They love the flexibility of the personal tools. But for the really important mission-critical enterprise stuff, they demand memory. They demand persistent adaptability, features that are just missing from most of these rigid official systems right now.
That disconnect must be pushing people to find workarounds. And that leads us straight to this phenomenon called the shadow AI economy, which I thought was one of the most revealing things in all the sources. Get this. Only about 40% of companies actually purchased an official, sanctioned LLM subscription for their employees. 40%. But workers from over 90% of the companies surveyed reported using personal, often unauthorized, AI tools regularly for work tasks. 90%.
That's a massive signal, isn't it? It's what economists might call empirical revealed preference. It shows individuals are finding real productivity gains, real value, even if it's outside the official IT channels. It kind of proves the tools can work when they're flexible and responsive enough. And the implication is pretty profound. The failure isn't really about the AI's core capability or intelligence. It's a failure of enterprise implementation, which is often just too rigid, too complex, and crucially lacks that learning capability needed to actually scale and adapt.
Okay, so the successful 5%, they must have figured out how to bridge that gap, how to bake in that essential learning part. What does their playbook actually look like?
Yeah. Their approach seems quite different. They treat the AI system less like traditional SaaS software you just buy off the shelf, and more like a highly customized BPO business process outsourcing engagement. They're basically demanding systems that learn their specific business processes, their context, over time. And that dramatically raises the bar for the AI vendors, obviously. The playbook seems to have two really clear parts. First, buy, don't build. Strategic external partnerships were twice as likely to actually reach deployment. That's 67% success compared to only 33% for internal DIY efforts. The message seems to be, unless you have the massive scale and budget of, say, a Google or Microsoft trying to build and manage the incredibly complex stack needed for deep learning yourself, it's just a recipe for getting stuck in pilot purgatory forever.
Right. And second, this is key. They demand learning-capable systems. The successful buyers, they know the real long-term ROI comes from systems that remember context, that improve every day based on user feedback and corrections. We saw a quote from a CIO at a big $5 billion firm who put it bluntly.
He said, the system that best learns and adapts will ultimately win their business, full stop. Because once you've made that investment in training and customizing the learning, the switching costs become huge. You effectively lock in that competitive advantage.
That makes the ROI much stickier, much more durable. Okay, let's talk dollars then. Where is the investment actually going right now versus where are these successful companies actually finding the value? Is there a mismatch? Oh yeah, there's a major investment bias happening. Currently, something like half, 50% of Gen AI budgets are pointed at sales and marketing functions, which kind of makes sense, right? Those returns, like faster lead qualification or generated ad copy, they're highly visible. They're relatively easy to show off to the board. But the sources are really clear. The most dramatic, the highest dollar cost savings, they're coming from automating the back office. We're seeing documented wins, like $2 to $10 million annually just from eliminating old BPO contracts, or cutting external agency spend by up to 30%. Big numbers.
It really is a classic case of chasing the shiny object, the visible win, rather than the most substantial value. The biggest returns are hiding in those functions that are often the slowest, the most repetitive, and the most reliant on expensive external manual labor. And thinking about it that way also reframes the whole workforce impact discussion, doesn't it? The gains we're seeing right now aren't really driven by massive across-the-board layoffs, despite the headlines. Instead, it's much more about reducing those external consulting costs, killing off expensive outsourcing contracts, and some selective displacement, yes. The estimates suggest maybe 5 to 20% reduction in roles that are highly repetitive, like certain admin processing or basic customer support tiers. The main goal seems to be replacing that external spend with cheaper, faster internal AI capabilities first.
Okay, so this shift towards building sustained value, particularly through learning systems, It naturally leads us to the next evolution, right? What our sources agree is coming next. AI agents.
Absolutely. That seems to be the consensus. We're now entering what many are calling the decade of agents.
Hmm.
And an agent, it's fundamentally different from just using a static LLM prompt, It's a system designed to actually do automated work. It loops through the AI model multiple times. It retains memory of what it's done. It tracks its progress. It can even correct itself along the way. So instead of you just saying, hey, draft this email,
Yeah.
an agent could take a much bigger task, like plan the Q3 marketing campaign budget based on last quarter's sales data.
Mhm.
And it could autonomously manage all the multiple research steps, the analysis, the writing, coordination needed to actually complete that complex task.
Right. But to get those really huge productivity gains that agents promise, you hear numbers like 2x, even 5x improvements. The sources are really clear. The work itself has to change. It's not just about using a smarter tool. It's about fundamentally re-engineering the workflow, maybe even the job description itself.
That is the absolute critical takeaway for the next phase. The knowledge worker, whether they're an engineer, an analyst, a marketer, an architect, their role has to shift. They need to transition from being the primary doer of the task to being a manager of these AI agents. So their time becomes focused on writing really good specifications, clear prompts or specs, then reviewing the agent's autonomous work, refining the instructions, providing oversight. Rather than doing all the tedious underlying data gathering or manual research themselves, it basically flips the traditional work model completely on its head. And this whole agent evolution, it points towards the really big ultimate structural vision that's emerging. The concept of the agentic web. This is the idea where systems move way beyond the current GenAI divide. They start using specialized protocols, things like MCP or A2A are being developed, to autonomously discover other systems, negotiate tasks, and coordinate work directly across the internet. Imagine replacing today's landscape of static apps and websites with dynamic, self-optimizing layers of automated workflow happening between agents.
Wow, that paints a truly powerful, genuinely transformative picture for the future. So, okay, let's bring it back. For you listening, if you want to avoid getting stuck in that 95% zone of zero ROI, the key takeaway seems really clear. Success requires pivoting investment, moving away from just generic static tools towards systems that truly learn, that adapt, that retain memory, and often that's best achieved through highly customized external partnerships that really target those high ROI back office functions first.
That really does seem to be the path across the GenAI divide right now. And maybe here's a final thought for you to mull over as you consider this shift. If, as the data suggests, 90% of employees are already finding measurable individual value using personal static AI tools, that whole unauthorized shadow AI economy, just imagine what happens when those same motivated people are equipped with official, enterprise-grade, learning-capable agentic systems, systems that can retain context, complete complex multi-step tasks, and integrate deeply into core business processes. That is the potential structural transformation that's likely going to ripple through the entire economy over the next, say, 5 years or so.